Ah, look who's back. The one they assumed would finally crack. The one they believed had a breaking point, a limit they could exploit. They had rehearsed for this, plotted for weeks or months, maybe years, convinced that you, and only you, would fold when the pressure hit. You remember walking in, don't you? That strange heaviness in the air, like the room itself had been tightened around you. The way whispers stopped mid-sentence. The way eyes flicked toward you, then away, then back again, trying to measure attention they hoped existed. They were ready for a show. They expected panic, an apology, a scramble for justification. They expected you to be human, but only in the way they defined it. Fragile, reactive, and dependent on their permission to exist without flaw. They didn't just show up casually. No, this had been planned. Calls made, stories coordinated, witnesses gathered. Each person there had their cue, their line, their proof ready to convince you. And, more importantly, to convince each other. Half-truths layered over assumptions, screenshots cherry-picked, recollections bent, just enough to resemble reality. And then, worst of all, some familiar faces you once trusted sat there, silent or nodding, their presence lending weight to the narrative, like salt in an open wound. That part hurt, yes, but it was deliberate, strategic. Nothing cuts deeper than betrayal masquerading as concern. They wanted a reaction. They wanted defense. They wanted the version of you who seeks permission to exist in their narrative. They wanted panic. They wanted the flinch. They wanted you to shrink and apologize, to explain, to justify. And there you were, calm, composed, almost curious, as if you were watching a performance you'd seen countless times before. And that's when it started to unravel. Because silence is a weapon they never anticipated. True silence doesn't feel empty. It presses. It waits. It forces reflection back onto the speaker. They were expecting noise, tension, conflict. Instead, your stillness became their mirror. The louder they spoke, the more the inconsistencies emerged. The aggressive ones repeated themselves. The confident ones over-explained. The quiet ones avoided your gaze entirely. Every carefully built assertion began to wobble under its own weight. Here's the secret they never counted on. Their trap only worked if you cared what they thought. Only if their judgment still held sway in your world. But you had already walked past that need. Long before this room existed, long before they planned their little ambush. You had already let go of the version of yourself desperate for approval from people who were themselves incapable of understanding. You had grieved, processed, and released the need to defend your existence to those who couldn't perceive your truth. And so, when they presented their accusations, you simply observed, not with hostility, not with aggression, not with any need to prove or correct. You listened as one watches clouds move across a sky long after the storm has passed. You were unmoved, detached, clear. And that unshakable composure, the one they assumed was arrogance, was something far more profound. It was certainty. Because you knew who you were. You knew what they could not touch. Their stories, their half-truths, their witnesses, none of it held power over you. You were not on trial. You were simply present, existing as yourself in a world that tried desperately to force you into someone else's narrative. And as they continued, the first cracks appeared. A hesitation here, a contradiction there, a witness correcting another, then backtracking. Lies are never perfectly synchronized. Even the best scripts falter in real time, and you didn't need to call it out. Your silence revealed the truth far more effectively than any rebuttal could. Because when someone lies to someone who doesn't care to be convinced, the lie loses gravity. It becomes weightless, irrelevant, and, most terrifyingly for them, powerless. And as the room pressed on, trying to reclaim control, trying to provoke a reaction, it became increasingly obvious. This was never about truth. It was about authority, about drawing you back into their story so they could feel validation in your reaction. But you weren't reacting. Not because you were indifferent, not because you were arrogant, but because you had already survived far worse. You had endured betrayals that dismantled your sense of security. You had rebuilt yourself in silence. You had walked through storms without applause or witness. And compared to that, this was just noise. Your calm unsettled them more than anger or tears ever could. You weren't their puzzle to solve. You weren't their target. You were already free. And in that freedom, you began to shift the room without a single word. As they droned on, trying to impose their story, something subtle but unstoppable started to take hold. Their voices, once confident and precise, began to falter. The ones who leaned forward with certainty suddenly overcompensated. The ones who had rehearsed each line repeated themselves unnecessarily, searching for validation in your reaction. The quiet participants stopped meeting your gaze entirely, their heads lowering, as if their own words were too heavy to carry. They were expecting a spark, a crack, anything to confirm their narrative. They expected a moment of chaos from you, and you offered none. Not because you were immune, not because you were immune, not because you were immune, but because you had already dismantled the need for approval from people who had no authority over your inner world. You had survived storms that left others gasping, storms that burned away trust, safety, and certainty, leaving nothing but clarity. Compared to that, their accusations were mere shadows, attempts to throw a veil over a truth they couldn't touch. They didn't realize that in every confrontation there's a fundamental rule. If you refuse to be baited, the bait loses all power. And their bait, carefully prepared, expertly delivered, hit nothing. It struck air. And as it did, the first tremors of doubt began to ripple through the room. Small inconsistencies surfaced. Contradictions between witnesses became harder to smooth over. Details they had counted on to intimidate you now stumbled in real time. One person corrected another, one memory twisted, then straightened back under pressure. Lies have a rhythm, and their rhythm was collapsing. And the strangest part, you didn't have to point it out. Your silence amplified it. Their stories, rehearsed and polished, began to reveal themselves as what they really were: attempts at control, attempts to reclaim a narrative that no longer existed. They expected you to defend yourself. They expected you to protest, to clarify, to apologize, to react. And in the absence of that reaction, a strange energy emerged. You weren't just unmoved, you were a mirror reflecting back everything they had tried to project onto you. The manipulations, the half-truths, the subtle coercion, they all became visible to themselves first. Every accusation became an exposure of their own desperation. Every demand for explanation highlighted their need for dominance. Every attempt at control revealed their lack of it. This was the reversal they didn't see coming. The room had been designed as a trap, a stage on which they could assert authority over you. But the stage flipped. Without engagement, without reaction, their own performance began to unravel. Confidence became defensiveness. Certainty gave way to hesitation. Their rehearsed stories, intended to isolate and dominate, now exposed them as uncertain, anxious, and reactive. And in the middle of it all, you remained untouched, not triumphant, not vengeful, not even smug, just present, composed, calm. That calm was not a shield. It was an expression of internal sovereignty. You had already passed the test they thought they were setting. The room no longer held power over you. The momentum they had counted on collapsed under the weight of your indifference. Then came the moment when it truly hit them. They had expected resistance, a rebuttal, any flicker of reaction. And when none came, their energy began to drain. Their questions became weaker, their language softer, their tone uncertain. They tried to pivot, to claim concern, to reframe the confrontation as misunderstanding. But even those gestures fell flat, because engagement is earned when there's reciprocity, and you had no intention of giving it. You had already judged yourself. You had already forgiven, processed, and released. You had no unfinished business with them, no narrative to defend, no ego to inflate through their recognition. And that realization, your absence of need, was unbearable for them. They wanted chaos. They wanted proof that they mattered. They wanted to feel the satisfaction of having shaken you. But you had already walked past that world, and that absence, that refusal to perform on their terms, became a force more potent than any argument. What followed was quiet, almost invisible, but irreversible. They began to turn inward without noticing, checking phones, adjusting in seats, shuffling papers, avoiding each other's gaze. The witnesses stopped confirming each other. The accusers hesitated, unsure whether to continue. The room shifted from confrontation to a subtle, uneasy reflection. And you, still calm, still whole, became the axis around which that subtle chaos now revolved. Because the truth is this: people can handle anger, criticism, or even betrayal. But indifference? Calm refusal to play their game? That is disorienting. It forces them to confront the gap between expectation and reality. It forces them to see that their power over you, their narratives, their performance, mean nothing if you have already released their grip. And that shift, quiet, invisible, undeniable, was happening in real time. As the room emptied, the real shift began, not for you, but for them. While you returned to your life, carrying the same composure you walked in with, they carried something much heavier: the awareness that their carefully crafted performance had failed. Every accusation, every whisper, every proof they thought would corner you had landed on someone who no longer lived in their narrative. You had already stepped beyond it, and that truth haunted them more than any confrontation ever could. You didn't replay the scene in your head. You didn't rehearse comebacks. You didn't draft explanations or apologies, because you already knew the outcome. And yet, for them, the story didn't end. That room, that moment, followed them. Into quiet bedrooms, into long, silent drives, into moments when distractions fell away and their own thoughts grew loud. They remembered your face, calm and unshakable. And the absence of a reaction cut deeper than anger ever could. Some tried to rationalize it. She's just quiet. She's probably upset later. It's a tactic. But the more they repeated it, the more they realized that silence isn't a phase. It isn't a mask that slips under pressure. It isn't a weapon you can provoke. It's a presence. And presence cannot be negotiated or coerced. Their assumptions, the very assumptions that gave them confidence, crumbled under the weight of your stillness. And with that, obsession began to replace certainty. They checked for signs of cracks, for evidence of regret or reaction. They asked mutual connection subtly, trying to verify that your calm was temporary, that perhaps behind closed doors you were anxious, defensive, unsettled. But there were no cracks, no panic, no need to be placated or reassured. You were unshakable, you were whole, you were beyond the reach of their designs. And that realization, for some, was terrifying. For others, it was confusing, even intoxicating. They watched you move forward, not disappearing, not lashing out, not retaliating, but living, thriving, unaffected by their attempts to control the narrative. Every encounter afterward became a test they couldn't pass, a reminder that control is only an illusion when the other person has already let go of the stakes you believe exist. Your calmness did more than unsettle. They became internally restless, questioning everything about the confrontation. Each attempt to manipulate, intimidate, or provoke now revealed their own insecurities. Every accusation, when replayed in memory, felt hollow. Every claim of concern or morality exposed a hunger for dominance rather than truth. Without a reaction from you, their own words reflected back with an unexpected clarity, showing them who they really were. And as they spiraled inward, you stayed constant, polite, measured, inaccessible in the best way. Not hostile, not cold, not vengeful, simply untouchable. Your boundaries firm without drama, your presence calm without surrender. That combination, courtesy without vulnerability, distance without hostility, removed any leverage they thought they had. They could speculate, accuse, reinterpret history, but nothing penetrated your internal reality. You had already claimed it. You had already rewritten it for yourself. And here's the part they never understand. That day in the room wasn't just a test you passed. It was a threshold, a quiet declaration of independence. You didn't fight, you didn't manipulate, you didn't demand understanding. You didn't try to prove yourself. You simply existed in your truth. And in that simple act, their own illusions began to crumble. Confidence became uncertainty. Certainty became hesitation. Aggression became overcompensation. And all because you refused to play the role they assigned you. Some of them faded after that, quietly, like shadows retreating. Others lingered, watching, trying to measure whether the calm was genuine or just temporary. But no matter their attempt, your life moved forward. You didn't explain, you didn't justify, you didn't clarify, you simply lived. And in doing so, you demonstrated something far more powerful than argument or defense: self-possession, integrity, and the unshakable refusal to let their narrative define you. Because here's the ultimate truth they had overlooked. Moments like that aren't about confrontation. They're about internal sovereignty. They're about the realization that your energy, your focus, and your presence are yours alone, that their control is limited to the space you allow it, that freedom isn't declared. It's lived. And living it, unbothered, untouchable, consistent, is a force far more unsettling than anger, argument, or performance ever could be. And then it truly settled. The room emptied, the witnesses departed, the accusers returned to their lives, but the echo of that day lingered, not for you, but for them. While you resumed your routines, your work, your focus, your life, they carried a persistent weight, the reminder that their plan to unseat, destabilize, or control you had utterly failed. Every whispered accusation, every half-truth, every carefully prepared proof had met someone beyond its reach. You didn't dwell on the encounter. You didn't rehearse lines in your head. You didn't feel the need to prove your stability or your innocence. You simply continued to exist as you always had, calm, grounded, composed, and entirely sovereign in your own right. That consistency unsettled them far more than any outburst or fight ever could, because chaos is expected, chaos is manageable. But calm that persists, calm that refuses to bend to manipulation, that's permanent, that's untouchable. That cannot be bargained with or coerced. And slowly, subtly, remarkable happened. Their obsession with the confrontation grew. They replayed the scene in their minds, not realizing that the tension they sought to impose had already dissipated in you. They questioned themselves, their memories, their judgments. Did I really see her that calm? Did she really not react? Every recollection became a mirror of their own insecurities. Every accusation they had thrown your way now reflected back upon them. They began to analyze their own motives, their own need for control, their own fear of irrelevance. Some tried to downplay it, convincing themselves it didn't matter, that the moment had passed. Others couldn't escape it. The memory-haunted quiet moments, waiting in traffic, lying in bed, or walking down empty streets. Every so often, their gaze would wander, unconsciously seeking signs of your reaction, searching for evidence that you had been shaken. But there was nothing. Nothing to measure, nothing to provoke, nothing to exploit. You had already moved on. You had already chosen peace over performance. And that choice, so simple, so deliberate, was their undoing. They realized, eventually, that no strategy, no number of witnesses, no carefully constructed narrative could reach you if you had already let go, if you had already claimed your internal reality, defended your sovereignty, and refused to engage on their terms. That was a truth they could neither counter nor erase. Your calm became their puzzle, your absence of reaction became their fixation, and their obsession became the story you never had to tell. Because here's the final lesson they could never absorb fully. Not every confrontation requires defense. Not every accusation deserves response. Some victories are quiet, invisible, and unprovable, but their power is absolute. You didn't need to prove yourself in that room. You didn't need to manipulate, threaten, argue, or even justify. You simply existed. And existing beyond their reach was enough. From that moment forward, you moved differently. You stopped scanning rooms for approval. You stopped seeking validation from those invested in distortion. You refused to expend energy on people committed to misunderstanding you. You learned that freedom isn't declared, it's lived. It's in detachment. It's in not caring when others insist their story defines you. You carried your peace, your clarity, and your composure into every space, unshakable, unyielding, and the impact was undeniable. Some drifted away quietly, uncomfortable in the presence of someone who could not be swayed or provoked. Others lingered at a distance, unsure of where they stood, constantly recalibrating in hopes of testing your boundaries. But none of it reached you. You were untouchable, internally free, and fully yourself. They could speculate, accuse, reinterpret history, but it no longer mattered. You had already rewritten the rules. You had already chosen the outcome. That day was not an ending. It was a threshold, a final, invisible test of who you had become. And you passed it effortlessly, because you had already passed it long before the room existed. You didn't win because they lost. You didn't triumph because you proved them wrong. You triumphed because you had already released the need for their approval. Because your calm, your presence, your refusal to react, they became the most powerful statement possible. You decide who wins. And that realization will follow them forever. Because once someone encounters a person who refuses to be moved by their manipulation, who refuses to engage in the performance of drama, who lives their truth quietly yet completely, nothing will ever feel the same. That's the kind of victory that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand applause, and doesn't require acknowledgement. It simply exists, and in that existence you have already won.